Hey there, Cryptid family. If you enjoy the chills, don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you're new, and hit that notification bell if you're not afraid of the whispers. The truck wouldn't start. He turned the key again, listening to the useless churn of the engine. Nothing but the hollow whump, whump, whump of a dead ignition. Damn thing, he muttered, shoving the door open and stepping onto the cracked dirt of his driveway. The farm stretched in every direction, an endless sea of dry earth and yellowing cornfields. The sun was sinking now, smothered by thick storm clouds rolling in from the west. A hot wind swept through the land, bending the stalks and rustling the dead husks. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the road. 20 miles to town. No chance of walking there tonight. Turning back toward the house, his eyes flicked to the scarecrow standing at the edge of the field. The thing had been there for years, stitched together from rotting burlap and old clothes. Its button eyes were mismatched, one black, one red, giving it a lopsided, watching expression. The grin stitched across its face was crude, the thread sagging in places where the fabric had begun to fray. He never liked the damn thing. With a final glance at the broken truck, he sighed and walked toward the house. The sky was nearly black now, the storm settling in heavy and humid. Thunder rumbled somewhere far off. Behind him the corn rustled, though the wind had stopped. Inside, he locked the doors, bolted the windows, and lit the old oil lamp on the kitchen table. The power was spotty out here. It was best to be prepared. The windmill outside creaked, its rhythm uneven, a deep, aching sound like something straining against old bones. He sat at the table, poured himself a whiskey, and tried not to think about how quiet it was. The cattle were restless, huddled close to the barn. Normally they roamed freely, grazing along the edges of the property. Tonight, they refused to go near the cornfield. He took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in his chest. His father had always warned him about nights like this. Nights when the air felt wrong, when the sky hung low and thick. Nonsense, he muttered to himself. But when he glanced out the window, his stomach tightened. The scarecrow's head was tilted, just slightly, like it was listening. The sound woke him sometime past midnight. A heavy thump outside, followed by the dry whisper of corn shifting against itself. He sat up, heart hammering. The house was silent, except for the slow tick of the clock. He slid out of bed, moving to the window. The field stretched out in silver under the moonlight, the corn swaying ever so slightly. And there, at the near edge of the field, closer than it should have been, the scarecrow. It had been hundreds of feet away before. He knew that. It wasn't possible. Yet there it stood, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle, its grin stretching wide under the moon's glow. His grip tightened around the shotgun leaning by the door. Number. It had to be a trick of the eyes, a shadow, a play of the wind. He stepped away from the window, his breath slow and measured. Back in bed, he stared at the ceiling, listening. But the house was silent. No more rustling, no more sounds. Eventually, he drifted into uneasy sleep. At dawn, he found something worse. The scarecrow was back in its original place. But the ground around its post was disturbed. Scattered dirt, deep indentations like something had been dragged. And near the porch, in the hard-packed dirt just outside his door, were marks, not footprints, something like fingers, as if something had crawled. The cattle refused to go near the fence line. They stayed close to the barn, their bodies pressed together in quiet distress. His hands clenched. Enough of this. Grabbing an old can of kerosene from the shed, he marched toward the field. He'd burn the damn thing. As he approached, his breath caught in his throat. The scarecrow's grin. It was wider now. The stitches had stretched, split in places, making it look like it had moved on its own. And at its base, soaking into the wooden post, was something dark. Something that smelled of rust and earth. Something like blood. His grip on the kerosene can tightened. The wind had stopped. The fields were silent. And for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. The scarecrow wouldn't burn. He stood over it, jaw clenched, watching the tiny flame dance at the tip of the match. The kerosene soaked its body, darkening the burlap and straw, yet the fire refused to catch. The moment the flame touched the scarecrow's ragged form, it simply flickered and died. That wasn't possible. He struck another match, bringing it closer. The light wavered, illuminating the crude stitching of its mouth, the mismatched button eyes. For a brief moment, it almost looked expectant. The match burned down to his fingertips. He cursed, shaking the sting from his hand. Enough of this. Grabbing the scarecrow by its brittle limbs, he ripped it from the post. The wood gave a groan, as if something deep inside the earth resented the act. For just a second, he swore he heard a low, breathy exhale, like the final sigh of something buried. The thought unsettled him, but he shoved it down. Dragging the scarecrow across the field, he hauled it into the woods behind the house, far from the corn and the windmill, far from his sight. He dug a shallow pit, dumping its limp body in and covering it with heavy dirt and branches. "Stay there," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. He turned back toward the house, forcing himself not to look over his shoulder. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The cattle, still pressed against the barn, let out uneasy groans. The windmill wasn't moving, but its creaking sound filled the air, a rhythmic moan that didn't match the stillness outside. And then there was the truck. Yesterday it had refused to start, its engine dead. Now, the headlights were on, casting pale beams into the fog-drenched field. The motor rumbled in a soft idle, as if waiting. His breath hitched. He approached cautiously, fingers tight around the shotgun slung over his shoulder. The truck door was closed, the windows fogged. Reaching for the handle, he yanked it open. Silence. The engine died instantly, as if whatever force had been running it had simply let go. And the worst part, the keys were still hanging inside, untouched, on the hook by the kitchen door. He slammed the door shut, his pulse thundering in his ears. That night, he barely slept. The house was filled with that unbearable silence, that creeping awareness that he wasn't alone. Every few moments, he'd hear a shift of wind, a groan of wood, the distant shuffle of dried corn husks brushing together. Then came the sound that froze him completely. A slow, rhythmic tapping against the porch railing. His body tensed. He lay there, listening, the shotgun already gripped in his hands. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was almost patient, a quiet waiting. He forced himself to move. Pushing the covers aside, he slid out of bed and crept toward the window, breath shallow. He placed his palm against the cool glass and peered outside. His stomach dropped. Sitting on the porch railing, facing the house, was the scarecrow. It was coated in dirt, clumps of earth still clinging to its fabric limbs. The burlap was torn, ragged from where he had buried it. And yet, it had returned, perched unnaturally on the railing like some grotesque sentry, and its grin, It was wider now, stretched to the point where some of the stitches had begun to tear. He stumbled back from the window, breath catching in his throat. Panic kicked in. He grabbed his shotgun, bolted the door, and shoved a chair under the knob. He couldn't stay here. He'd take the horse if he had to, ride to town, get help, get away from whatever this was. But as he moved toward the back door, something shifted. A shadow fell across the window. His steps faltered. Slowly, heart hammering against his ribs, he turned his head toward the glass. The scarecrow was standing there now, not perched, not slumped against the railing, standing upright, its head tilted slightly to one side. Watching, he stepped back, gripping the shotgun tighter, sweat rolling down his back. That wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. The air grew thick, suffocating. The windmill outside wasn't moving, yet its groaning creak filled the air, pressing in from every side. Then the door rattled, not from the wind. There was no wind. It was deliberate, slow, a testing push against the frame. Then came the whisper, thin, rasping. It spoke his name. He clenched his teeth, pressing his back against the wall. His fingers ached from how tightly he held the gun. And then, silence. Everything stopped. Even the cattle outside had gone deathly still. A minute passed, then two. Finally, he let out a slow breath. He dared to take a single step toward the peephole. The scarecrow was gone. His shoulders sagged with the weight of relief, though his hands still trembled. He exhaled, shaking his head. But before he could turn, from the darkness behind him, inside the house, came a single, deliberate step. The step behind him was real. He spun, shotgun raised, ready to fire, but there was nothing there, just the dim interior of his house, flickering lamplight casting long shadows. His breath came shallow and uneven. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and unnatural. Then he saw the door. It was open. The chair he had jammed under the knob was on its side, as if something had forced its way in. His fingers flexed around the stock of the shotgun, his instincts screaming at him to move, to run, to do anything but stand there. Then came the sound, wet, dragging, from outside. He stepped onto the porch, weapon raised. The wind had picked up, rattling the eaves, making the old windmill creak like it was alive. He scanned the darkness, searching for the thing that had come inside. And then, something lunged from the shadows. A blur of rotted burlap and straw slammed into him, knocking him against the porch railing. A hand, if it could be called that, clamped around his throat. It felt wrong, like a mix of rotting leather and something moving underneath. The stench was unbearable. With a desperate gasp, he jammed the shotgun into its gut and pulled the trigger. The blast sent the thing staggering backward, the burlap snapping and tearing, but it didn't fall. He watched, stunned, as the scarecrow straightened, slowly, methodically, like a puppet on half-cut strings. It didn't move like a man. Its head twitched, as though testing its balance. The wound from the shotgun blast should have destroyed it, should have torn it apart. But there was no blood. Instead, something moved beneath the burlap. Something slick, black, and writhing. The tattered hole in its chest revealed a glimpse of what lay beneath the fabric. Not stuffing, not straw, but something alive. And then its grin widened. The stitches pulled, snapping in places, revealing a black, gaping maw lined with too many teeth. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it. But deep in his gut, he knew a lock wouldn't stop it. The farm was no longer safe. He needed to leave. Grabbing a satchel, he stuffed it with whatever supplies he could. Ammunition, his father's old hunting knife, a flask of whiskey, anything useful. But as he stepped outside, the wind picked up, and that was when he noticed the movement in the corn. It wasn't the wind. Something was in there. Slow, deliberate shuffling sounds. Too big to be an animal. He swallowed hard, gripping the shotgun tighter, his boots crunching against the dirt as he made his way toward the field's edge. That was when he saw it, something half buried in the soil, a body. His stomach lurched as he crouched beside it, brushing away the dirt. The corpse's hands were bound, the mouth sewn shut with thick black thread. He knew those clothes, the old work shirt, the boots, the belt, his father's. A sharp, cold dread knotted in his chest. His father had disappeared years ago. He had assumed the old man had left, walked off and never returned. But he had never left at all. The scarecrow wasn't just a deterrent. It was a warning. And someone had put it there to keep something buried. A low rustling made him whip his head up. Something was moving. Not just one thing. Many. Figures emerged from the corn. They were wrapped in rotted burlap, their faces hidden beneath stitched-together sacks. Their bodies moved unnaturally, jerking, twisting, their limbs too long, too thin. But worst of all, they were whispering. Not words, something worse, something old. And standing at the center, watching him, was the scarecrow. It hadn't moved yet, but he could feel it smiling. His breath hitched in his throat. Then they charged. He fired, dropping one, but it didn't stay down. Hands clawed at him, fingernails snapping off in his flesh as they tore at his arms, his shoulders. He tried to run, but something grabbed his ankle, sending him sprawling onto the dirt. And then, above him, the scarecrow moved. One moment, it was standing still. The next, it was on top of him, its stitched hands pressing against his face, its fingers burrowing into his skin. He screamed as something sharp pierced into his temples, his jaw, his chest. And then, darkness. The Anderson family moved in just before the first frost. A fresh start, the real estate agent had called it, a quiet place to raise their kids. The scarecrow was already there when they arrived. Jake woke in the middle of the night to a strange creaking sound outside his window, the windmill turning. But there was no wind. The next morning, Jake padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom," he called. No answer. The back door was wide open. A trail of dirt led inside, and on the kitchen table sat his father's head, mouth stretched into a wide, stitched grin. Pieces of straw stuck out from his eye sockets. Jake took a step back. Something rustled behind him, a voice, thin, rasping. "You're next."